I'm somewhere in the cyberspace of Rollins College. My name is Anna Heller, and I am the Bruce A. Beal Director of the Cornell. And tonight I'm a very happy museum director because we get to host this extraordinary event, a conversation between artist Shirin Neshat and curator Molly Epstein. Now, for all of you gathered here tonight, I am sure that the role and the stature and the voice of Shirin Neshat in contemporary art is a given. What you may not all know is how immensely consequential her art has been and is here on the campus of Rollins. Her works that belong to our Alfond collection of contemporary art are among the most requested by our faculty for teaching consistently over time. And for that, we owe a debt of gratitude to Molly Epstein, who not only has been actively involved in shaping our Alfond collection of contemporary art, but also was the catalyst who made tonight's event possible. Molly is an art historian and a curator who has been involved over time in very significant exhibition projects with many of our leading artists of today, among them Anish Kapoor, Teresita Fernandez, Nicole Eisenman, and of course, Shirin Neshat. And after about a decade in working in galleries in both New York and London, she joined Goodman Taft in 2016, which is when she got to get involved with us and with our Alfond collection of contemporary art. And I suspect having something to do with the three tremendous acquisitions of works by Shirin Neshat, the most recent of which is brand new, and you will hear a little bit about it later tonight for the very first time. So who better to lead us in this conversation? I am absolutely delighted to pass the virtual mic to Molly, who will introduce our esteemed guest tonight. Thank you.
Thank you for that lovely introduction, Anna. On behalf of Gisela Carbonell, the curator at the Cornell Fine Arts Museum, and my colleague Abigail Ross Goodman, consulting curator at CFAM, we're also thrilled to welcome you this evening for this conversation with Shirin. We'll be speaking for 45 minutes or so, but please feel free to pop any questions into the Q&A at the bottom of your screen, and we'll take time at the end to take questions. Shirin Neshat truly needs no introduction, of course, but I will quickly recount some of her very impressive biography to date to frame our conversation today and some of the images we'll be looking at together. Neshat has held solo exhibitions at galleries and museums worldwide, including the Museo Carrere in Venice, the Hirshhorn Museum and Sculpture Garden in DC, the Detroit Institute of the Arts, and the Serpentine Gallery, London. Most recently, a major retrospective of her work titled I Will Greet the Sun Again opened at the Broad in Los Angeles in 2019. And that show is currently on view at the Modern Art Museum of Fort Worth through May the 16th. So I hope if anyone is in Texas or in the vicinity, they will make their way there before the exhibition comes to a close. Neshat is the recipient of numerous prizes and awards, including the Golden Lion at the 48th Venice Biennale in 1999, the Davos World Economic Forum's Crystal Award in 2014, and the Premium Imperiale in 2017. She has directed 2 feature-length films, Women Without Men and Looking for Kursum. And in 2017, Neshat also directed her first opera, Aida, at the Salzburg Music Festival, which will be mounted again next year. So thank you so much, Shirin, for joining us this afternoon. It's a gift to be in conversation with you today.
Thank you for having me, and thanks to the museum and to the Rollins College for everything they've done to support me.
So as Anna mentioned, we are very lucky and privileged to have 3 works of yours in the Alfond collection of contemporary art. And this is a teaching collection, so it's utilized by students and faculty across departments and enjoyed by a broad public at the university and beyond. And as Anna mentioned, the works have had an incredible impact since their acquisition. So I thought that today we could dive into the 3 bodies of work represented here, Women of Allah, Book of Kings, and the most recent, Land of Dreams, to explore how these photographic works, which range in date from the mid-90s to very recently, demonstrate various ongoing themes of interest for you, from power to poetry to politics. So we'll start with this image, which is in the collection titled My Beloved, which is a photograph of you and your young son, Cyrus, taken in '95. And this was the first body of work you made after your visit back to Iran, your first visit back after the revolution in '79. And this body of work looms so large for all of us. I wonder if you can speak a little bit about what prompted you to make this series of self-portraits, and begin this studio narrative photographic practice, which has evolved so significantly to date.
I think it's interesting that the three different work that is in the collection of Rollins College are really significant part of my work, in a way that they really are clear evolutions, and I can talk about it later. But with the Woman of Allah, it comes from an extreme sense of nostalgia that I had from having been away from the country for over 11 years, for having been, sort of displaced from the country because of the revolution and because of the breakdown of diplomatic relationship between Iran and US. And so I basically found myself alone in this country since I was 17. And so, for me, those years of abandonment or displacement or alienation were quite difficult and dark. And as I had a very loving family at home, and so eventually in 1990, when the opportunity came for me to go back to finally see my family in the country, and I took my son, who actually was Korean Iranian, and so he was like, I think 3 years old when we went the first time, and that experience it was embedded with my extreme feeling of nostalgia and the desperation for reunion with my family in the country, as I really longed for that. But also, it really became the breaking point for me as an artist, because I had not made art before that. After I finished school, I just abandoned art. So in a way, by talking about this work of Woman of Allah, it's almost impossible to separate the evolution of my personal life versus the work. And by now, I had a passion of sort of reconnecting to the country that had transformed so vastly by the Islamic Revolution. And I was very interested in some of the ideas or the ideology of the Islamic Revolution, the notion of fundamentalism that sort of grew so vastly in the Iranian society, and it transformed it. How the religious fervor played such a major role in the society today, where when I was living there, it was not like that. It was a very secular society, and the religion was a choice. So I really focused on the notion of martyrdom that became central theme for the Islamic Revolution, in a way that the concept of martyrdom had become institutionalized. Even people were encouraged to be martyrs and devote and die to go to heaven. And so there was this obsession or celebration of death, which was really odd. And so I became very obsessed with this philosophical, moral, and ideological concept of martyrdom as a way of stating love of God, devotion, self-sacrifice of life and the material world, and yet idea of cruelty, violence, and ultimately death. And particularly, I was really obsessed with the study of the woman who voluntarily became militant. And that seemed to be, immediately a contradiction to the idea of Muslim women being very submissive, very much passive, and very victim. So that created another kind of contradiction for me. So just to summarize it, because I could talk about this work forever, is the Woman of Allah sort of embody all these notions of paradoxicals that I find in this form of philosophical, sort of ideological direction, where you love and you kill, you give birth and you at the same time you're willing to end life, or the woman who is very sensual, erotic, yet is armed, and of course the body of the woman being so controversial and problematic as it provokes sexuality, and yet it's covered with the veil, which is very symbolic, both repression and independence. And so it's loaded with all kinds of symbolism that sort of suggests an idea of conflicting forces. And then to add to all this was a text that became only poetry by Iranian women that were not religious texts. And for example, in this case, my beloved, my character, which by the way, they became mainly self-portraits. I tried to play the role, like Frida Kahlo was the subject of her own paintings, but those were about her life. Here, they were not about my life. I was performing the role. And I had a friend photographing me, and I knew the gaze that I wanted to express, and the gaze became significant as the images were ultra minimal, with very few body expressions. And so this kind of trajectory or this journey of this woman, from my intention was to show her in different facets. Here as a mother, but the weapon being the ultimate reminder of her conviction to religious fervor, the fundamentalism, militancy, and the way that it contradicts this affectionate pose with the child that she protects and she brings to life. But next to her is this extremely dangerous weapon. So for me, this was several photographs that I did that it was about this woman, the model, the character, with her child. Yet there were other images, let's say with floral pattern flowers that were like more decorative. In this case, it's really, again, the image on the right is this kind of passive aggressive, the idea of being brainwashed in many ways and sort of going along with this kind of rhetoric of the Islamic fundamentalism. But by the contact of the hand over the mouth is also sort of an expression of wanting to break the silence. And for me, the literature, the poetry became the voice, and that kind of the voice of the woman, the emotional, the intellectual expressions. The image on the left, allegiance is wakefulness, but it's really a very provocative image because I think it's extremely erotic, and the bottom of the feet, which is really problematic in the, Iranian or Islamic culture. So, I was really sort of within the very few kind of vocabularies, the feet, the hand, the face, the eyes, I was trying to elaborate a number of images that were very potent and very subversive, but always contained these elements of the body, the weapon, the veil, and the text.
And the gaze in these photographs is so frontal and direct and confrontational. And that's something that one senses in all of your sitters, even now, the sort of direct relationship between the subject or the sitter and the camera and what you're capturing. Can you say a little bit about the choice to be so direct in the communion between yourself in the making of this series that's extended through today, and how you capture subjects with such vulnerability and incisiveness?
Yeah. You put it's such an important point that I myself hadn't thought about. But if you really look consistently through my work, there is this melancholy in the gazes of the people, whether they're American or from Egypt or Azerbaijan or Iran or Mexico. There's something about the vulnerability of the human figure, the people who are conditioned one way or another to certain circumstances that is beyond their control, political, religious, economic, all kinds of things. And so there is simultaneously in this gaze the notion of pride, but also, you know, melancholy. And I think that the other day when I went to see the exhibition of Land of Dreams back in January, when you enter the room with all those eyes of Americans of different backgrounds, you get the same emotional impact as you do when you look at women of Allah. And they're from totally different culture.
Yeah.
And I think this really goes back to that even though Women of Allah was about Iran and Iranian revolution, I think the series above and beyond it talks about humanity. It really touches on something that it's not just only about the specificities of a culture. It's about our humanity and our human being, our conditions living under circumstances that are beyond our control.
Yeah.
Let's say someone who's raised in a very impoverished religious community, and the only thing that comes to their rescue, that it's religion, you know, and ultimately certain rhetorics, religious rhetorics, is very attractive to them because faith, you know, and beliefs help you cope with life, you know, with hardship. And so this is not a criticism of religion, but this is, you can understand the way in which all of us are conditioned. And so the eyes for me are extremely expressive and universal in what they convey.
And the complexity of identity. I feel like these images capture so many different versions and guises of femininity, of motherhood, of the militant woman during the revolution and beyond. And I think that that same complexity of personhood is present in each and every body of work because every sitter is multidimensional.
Absolutely. And the thing I like to add to that is true. I should have mentioned that I think for the woman, particularly Iranian woman or a woman at large, you know, there is more sense of vulnerability, you know, and in their experience in this planet, I think as mothers, as women who have to struggle more than men, we all know that. So I think the sense of fragility, vulnerability, the emotionality, it's more easily expressed in a female figure and female expression, where although I think I have finally crossed that bridge by being able to also make images of men whose eyes are extremely expressive, extremely melancholic and vulnerable in the way that they speak to us. But majority of the men that I know, they like to give this expression when they're posing that everything is under control. You know, everything is great. Where with women, when we're posing for camera, we tend to let go a lot more, I think, as a photographer. So yeah, I think femininity is a major part of my work.
Well, I'm going to take us ahead many years to 2012 when you made a series titled The Book of Kings around the time of the Green Movement. And this was an immersive photographic installation pictured here in your show at the Hirshhorn a few years ago. And the series of photographs was divided up into three groups: the masses, which you can see on the left, the patriots pictured here, and the villains. And the title comes from Shahnameh, or the Book of Kings, which is a traditional Persian text and illuminated manuscript. So I wonder if you can speak a little bit about that moment of watching the Green Movement and the Arab Spring that followed from afar here in New York, and what prompted this examination of sort of youthful revolution or a new face of revolution.
Well, to our young friends who may not remember, the 2009 Green Movement, which then led to the Arab Spring all over the Arab world, was the most pivotal political event, at least in Iran, since the Islamic Revolution, which was 1979. And this was a group, it was a massive uprising by essentially young people who did not want to have a revolution or overthrow the government, but they wanted to have democracy and some idea of liberation. There was a fraud election. And they became extremely patriotic and courageous in terms of pouring down the streets. And it was very contagious all over the country. Even the Iranians living outside began to protest. And it was all about this movement to overthrow the idea of kings or people who, basically not overthrow the government, but the idea that everything had to be channeled through this one form of power. Anyway, but it was a very euphoric, I would say, movement. And sadly, it was sabotaged very badly. And many of these young people got killed, arrested, tortured, and, just horrible aftermath. So the Book of Kings was, as the woman of Allah sort of narrated the Islamic Revolution, sort of the historical moment in Iranian, history of revolutions where we became Islamicized, and the woman of Allah showed idea of fanaticism that sort of grew in Iran. Opposite, in the Book of Kings, it was no longer related to religion. These young people were not religious. They were modern and forward thinking. They were internet generation. And all they wanted was some idea of moderation and liberty. But the idea of patriotism, nationalism was really big. And what's really interesting is that every time we have this notion of patriotism, it always borders violence and genocide. The Book of Kings, the original Book of Kings from 10th century by Ferdowsi, is a book that essentially, as a book of epic poems, it's a mythological way of narrating Iranian history during the Arab conquest. Again, we had heroic figures who voluntarily offered their lives for their nation. So there was this notion of patriotism that was repeating again in 2009. So for me, it was this kind of symbolic reference of the past to the present and how history is repeating itself. As you can see in the images, people were being beheaded. And again, this was when Iranians were trying to protect their country from the Arab conquest. And, now in these images, you see that these three villains, the paintings of the war are, inscribed on their body, meaning that they embody war and violence. And their expression, their gaze, really sort of suggested the notion of power. Opposite to the woman of Allah, the Book of Kings became their narrative. You had series of patriots that you showed with the men and women with their hands on their heart, which is a universal gesture of legion of honor, love of your nation. And then the group of photographs, the masses, which were like, the innocent bystanders, the people. And then you had the people of power who controlled the destiny of everyone. So in many ways, I think that this group of work, it sort of pays tribute to that euphoric uprising, that sort of the patriotic movement that did not have a good ending, neither in Iran or anywhere else in the Arab world.
Yeah. Well, and what you can see here, which we'll see again in Land of Dreams, is that the importance of the immersive, monumental, environmental scale of these photographic installations, where the images have potency and great power when they stand alone, but there's also this environmental experience of walking into the entire series. And that's been important now for some time.
Molly, I think that was a little bit of an influence of me moving toward video and cinema, where I became more of a storyteller.
Yeah.
Where before with the woman of Allah, it was like everything had to be set in a single image,
right.
Where I felt like, multiple images and creating this cultural situation where the audience were actually caught in between all these gazes that were looking directly at them,
yeah.
In different body postures. It really created a strong emotional impact. something that the video installations of mine were able to do. But I had problem with the single photographs when they had to function on their own, and didn't do that, you see.
Well, and it's also beautiful demonstration of how important poetry and history and allegory have been for you from the beginning. And the three different strategies of how the text is veiled over the faces of the masses and larger and more painterly in the case of the patriots, and then here in the villains where they're actually scenes from Shahnameh painted. But I wanted to show a few images of you working on the surface of Roja, one of the patriots, because this
because a lot of people think these are photoshops.
No. Well, and so this both as a formal gesture and a conceptual motif has been vital to the practice from the beginning. And this idea of integrating text and poetry and the painterly calligraphic gesture feels so important to the work throughout. And I know there are certain Persian poets that are historically of great interest and inspiration to you. And I wonder, before we jump into Land of Dreams, how the textual sources have changed and evolved, and how you decide how to pair which text with which image.
I think overall, when I look back in my own work retrospectively, I see two things reappearing over and over again. A strange interest in history, narrating history, from Woman of Allah to the Book of Kings, Land of Dreams about American history, Woman Without Men movie about the 1953 coup. So that's history. Literature, I've had strong affinity with literature, even though I can't say I'm a big reader, but I have some reason really strongly identified with certain poets in Iran, particularly women poets, that their words express everything that I'm not good with words, but the way that on a more mystical and philosophical and political level, they communicate to the world some things that are so profound, but so abstract in a way, I can really relate to. And Molly, I grew up in a country that it's rooted in poetry and literature. Yeah. I mean, Iran is a country of ancient to modern and contemporary mystics and poets and novelists. And we are also a country that is lived through a huge amount of dictatorship, censorship, lack of freedom of expression. So naturally, Iranian people, more than many countries I can think of, gravitate toward the language of poetry for its allegorical, metaphorical values, because you can say everything that is not on the surface, So it's very subversive and it's quite abstract with poetry. And so a lot of average Iranian people have memorized a great deal of poetry that they actually share at home with each other or with their friends. So that's part of explanation why I've inherited this culture. But also I think really essentially, I think I am a poet, a visual poet. Yeah. I'm not good with words, but the way I relate to the world and the way I am an artist, the constitution of my work, it's through poetry. It's poetry in a way that I don't feel comfortable talking about realism. Even when I approach politics or history or religion, I like to do it in an allegorical way, through dreams, through magic realism, through surrealism, through metaphors. I don't like anything straightforward. It's just not the way I can make art. And that's precisely how these poets express themselves. Always on the sideways, never in a realistic way. And you know what? Their work is lasting hundreds and hundreds and thousands of years because of that power, enigma, obscurity, and somehow universality, Mm-hmm. So I think I was deeply impacted by the power of that kind of language that an artist can engage, where you can allow a certain obscurity, enigma, ambiguity, that somehow someone in the US can look at this work and kind of relate to it, even if they don't understand the word or the specificities of the culture. So I'm just going a long way around it. So my relationship to poetry, it's both because I feel like a poet and also because I'm massively interested in other people's literature.
Yeah. Well, and the text becomes so painterly, and one experiences it on a number of different levels, and it's another way into the work that creates another layer of beauty and illusion. And this takes us into the latest project titled Land of Dreams. And this is another monumental photographic installation. Here it is, pictured at Gladstone Gallery earlier this year, of over 100 photographic images. It also includes 2 video works and a feature film, which is currently in post-production and nearing completion, which is very exciting. And it's your first project shot entirely here in the US after shooting extensively in Morocco and Turkey and elsewhere over the past several decades. So the story is of an art student who takes people's portraits and collects their dreams, and we'll look at more images from the video and from the feature film shortly. But I'm curious what prompted you to turn your camera to the American West to tell this story at this moment after so much work that you've shot abroad?
Well, there's so many reasons, but one thing I've learned about myself is that there always comes a time where I need to challenge myself and move on from what I've been doing.
Yeah.
For example, from Woman of Allah, I went to video, then I went to cinema, then I come back to, photo installations, always working outside. But I think came a time by 2019, 2018, where I really felt that it was very strange that I had neglected the country that I've lived longest than anywhere else, that I felt I shied away for giving myself the license to sort of indulge in a study of this culture, and how, in fact, as an immigrant, as an Iranian immigrant, my life is also invested in this country, and how I know this country quite well by now from my perspective, and that how much I love and dislike about this country. And by the time came Trump era, there was an added, not pressure, but added sense of responsibility that, hey, maybe my voice as an Iranian immigrant also matters in this conversation about the changing identity of America, which used to be called the Land of Dreams. And it was for me a very big challenge of, could I come up with an idea that, without being overly polemic or didactic in the way of, now I'm going to capture America, but to really sort of make a very personal journey and give my personal perspective about what I think America looks like. The image you're looking at, it's what I think America looks like. Yeah. With all its diversity of people's ethnicity, economic background, religious backgrounds, the Land of Dreams installations, I think it has exactly 111 photographs, shows people that are functional, dysfunctional, Black, white, Native Americans, Hispanic, Anglo, young, middle age to old, and women and men. And so one thing I loved, which was something I hadn't done very often, and what was different about the Land of Dreams, I was a very active member in this body of work as I traveled and recruited these people. We interviewed them. And so the work became somewhat fiction and documentary. I was not sitting at a studio bringing people to the studio to photograph. Rather, we would literally, with Julia and my friend Lena, who actually took the photographs, we traveled through different cities in New Mexico and offered a small amount of money, but we asked to photograph people. And in We interviewed them about their lives, but also asking about their dreams. So it became a very fascinating sociological, artistic project, and really made me feel that it opened a door for me for the future in a way that there's so much possibility, so many stories to tell from my perspective in America.
And can you tell us a little bit about the narrative of the video and the film, where the protagonist, Simin, who is a kind of surrogate or a stand-in for you, perhaps, how she moves through this landscape and her kind of living between two worlds of meeting with people in their homes and taking their portraits, and then the second environment within this desert rock?
Well, as I said, I meant for this work to be one of the most personal work I've ever made, and ultimately, the project entails photographic installation, videos, and a movie. And the main protagonist is an Iranian woman immigrant photographer. So obviously, that itself is like a giveaway. And also, I've found over the years, like Roja, that you just showed her picture, that I'm really drawn into certain women that look a certain way. If you compare Simin, who is this lady who plays the main role, and Roja, they're very similar in their physique, very small, big eyes. And so I'm attracted to create these alter egos, these doubles, that maybe they will look something like I would idealize myself, a younger version of me. I don't know, but she is supposed to be the one who took all the photographs. In the video, the story is that there is this very strange, colony. Maybe we show the colony first, if you have any images of the colony. Yeah, I think it may be the next one. That, yeah, here, and the next one, I believe, that there is this colony that a lot of Iranian people, it's a very surreal and unbelievable situation where there's bureaucrats, there's people in lab coats receiving and analyzing American people's dreams in this bunker that looks like they should be making atomic bomb, but instead they're going through massive amount of photos and dreams of Americans. Her job, now you can go back to the previous shot, is to photograph and interview people and ask for their dreams, like I did in the photograph. Yeah. So she goes door to door and introduces herself. And maybe Molly, you can go like one more. Yes. So she goes and introduces herself that I'm an art student, disguising herself as that, and that as a project, I need to take people's pictures. And then at the end, she says, "Oh, can I also ask you a favor? Can you tell me your latest dream?" And so some of those dreams we actually filmed. And, it's very diverse. This man, its dream, it's all about fear of nuclear holocaust because he was a military man. Other women, this woman had fear of losing her child because she was kept in a convent because the natives were forced to be separated from their families and kept in convents so they forget their religion and language. So there were all these very strong nightmares and issues and themes that somehow made the protagonist slowly identify with them and feel like actually her enemies' dreams and nightmares are not that different from hers. Eventually, she gets kicked out of the colony for misbehaving and sort of emotionally connecting to her subjects.
Well, and I found these scenes of Simin entering people's homes and photographing them to be these incredibly intimate encounters. And in terms of vulnerability and the gaze and things we've spoken about already, these are these incredibly almost sacred exchanges between artist and subject, or art student and sitter, and captures, I think, some of the same themes of humanity and what brings us together, what makes us the same. And there's this incredible scene in the video where she pushes through the double doors into this space that's covered with portraits, almost an endless array of the subjects. And visually, it's just such a compelling and captivating image. So both in the still photographs and in the video, the scenes are very charged and incredibly resonant.
Similar to like Woman of Allah and all the other works that I've done, with the Land of Dreams also it's all about opposites. You have natural landscape, then you have this claustrophobic interior industrial landscape. You have Iran in one side and you have America on the other side. You have dream and reality. You know, you have the internal life of this woman and the sociological information about America and the hostility with the US. So there were all these different parallels going on. And I think that it's quite consistent with everything that I've always done.
Yeah.
This notions of opposite always going simultaneously.
What can you tell us about the feature, which I know is in progress? And you managed to shoot a feature film in the midst of a pandemic in New Mexico last fall, which is no small feat. And I know making a film in this moment where so much is remote must be a new experience after all the video and cinema work of the last several decades.
You know, I was just talking to our editor today that I've been working for the past 5 months. I've never met in person.
Right.
And I say that Land of Dreams movie is the baby of a pandemic because we shot it in New Mexico we went there September until December. And literally, we were in a situation that any day the production could be shut down. Yeah. And we were being tested every other day. We lost some of our actors. But at the same time, there was this urgency about let's make this film and not get sick and let's not get shut down. And I think the actors really also wanted to work. And for me, the movie took off from where the video left, which is again the subject of an Iranian woman, immigrant, obsessed with collecting people's photographs and dreams. The only difference in the movie is that she doesn't work for the Iranian colony. She works for American government. She works for the Census Bureau. There is a colony, but that pays very little part. And so her obsession is that she collects people's dreams, and the ones that she's very passionate about, she impersonates them. She impersonates them when they're telling their dreams. And then she feeds them in the social media, the film slightly in the future, and then sends it to Iran. And then the other two main characters, and Sheila Vand, who played Simin in the video, the brilliant actress, she plays the main role here. And Matt Dillon and William Mosley here are the two other main actors who, in many ways, in my mind, they embody the nature of American society, which is he's a cowboy, the John Wayne, but the modern cowboy, you know, the bad guy is like a super macho, always a superior, knows it all. The other guy is naive, romantic, is a dreamer, is an idealist, is like many Americans are. It's very fragile and sort of, it's just, and they're both kind of, well, he's in love with her. They're both always with her. So in a way, she's always facing these two opposite natures of America identity. And then here's Isabella Rossellini, who is virtually having guests. And this is slightly in the future where we could potentially have dinners and not be there ourselves, but eat the same food, maybe the same glass of wine. And she's hilarious. And so this is one of the households that she goes to visit. Just like the video, she goes to different households. And then this is the Iranian colony, which is actually a sort of also a kind of surreal colony that is built by the American government, keeping many ex-revolutionaries, Iranian revolutionaries, and now they're old, but still want to overthrow the Iranian government. So a lot of Iranian people I know that they still haven't gotten over the fact that there's no way they can do anything, and they're kept in this village that looks like it could be in Iran. So it's a long story short, that's what it is. And this is the final scene of the film where Simin lays out all the photographs that she has taken of the American people and photographs of her own family.
Well, the film will no doubt be a triumph. We're excited for it to come to fruition and to see it someday soon. But thank you for sharing that sneak peek with all of us. And then I'm just going to scroll back quickly before we turn to the audience for questions. You know, one thing that immediately struck us upon seeing the exhibition at Gladstone and seeing Land of Dreams in the full immersive environmental installation is that there was this image of a mother and child, which alongside many other compelling portraits of men and women and children really captured our attention. And thinking about My Beloved from 95 and this portrait, Magdalene Phoenix from 2019, I wondered if there was anything you might say about motherhood and identity now, all these years on, looking at this other portrait of a mother and her son.
Well, the one thing that I think comes clear in both is the love of the child and the relationship. It's interesting when I think about it because my son is half Korean and Iranian, and this child is half black and half white. and I think the embrace of the mother, to me, it felt like a painting. You know, they came together, and the child was very restless. But I think the gaze of the mother and the child is so telling of such a profound love, you know, and I don't know, I don't even have the words to say it. You know, I have a son, and I think that for me, it has been the single most important event in my life to have been a mother and to know what defines being a mother, that kind of unconditional love. Actually, the wording for the My Beloved, it says, I give you life, and as to me, Mira, but I die from you, but you give me life. You know, this whole thing about life and death, and the idea of how, you know, the fact that the relationship between a child and mother is permanent. Nothing. I mean, that's how I relate it to it, and it's such a profound relationship, and so I think that comes from me looking at other mothers and how they relate to their child, you know, and it's funny because in the entire group of Land of Dreams, this is the only image of two people in a single photograph. There were others who wanted to be photographed together, but I really thought this pair was really important.
Special. Well, thank you for that. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and I'm going to open the Q&A and see what has come in from the audience. So Gisela, who's the curator at CFAM, has asked, what do you hope our students take away from experiencing your work at the museum?
Wow, that's a big question. Well, you know, I think the only way I can explain this is that, answer this, is that you take away from the artwork with, depending on what you're expecting, like who you are and what is your relationship to art and to the nature of that work, culturally speaking, politically speaking, aesthetically speaking. In my work, and you know, I have very multiple different audiences. I find my work affecting people completely differently because they bring to the work their own knowledge and interest in the subject and the culture. And also the emotionality and the aesthetic of the work. Maybe for some people, my work is too emotional, you know, or too political, you know, or too foreign, you know, or too beautiful. And then there are others who really embrace it. So what I like people to take away from it, especially students, I think more than anything, how personal the appeal is. The artist is in the work, you know, how present the artist is, I think.
We have another question from Hind Bergy, who I'm actually going to quote later on, Hind, from something that we published in a book in 2018. She writes, so many artists use displacement and cultural polarities as central themes in their practice. Do you think contemporary artists have a responsibility to discuss these topics along with globalism and transnationality in their work?
Can you repeat the first part again?
So many artists use displacement and cultural polarities as central themes in their practice. Do you think contemporary artists have a responsibility to discuss these topics in their work?
Well, I have to be very honest. I've never gravitated toward any subject because I thought it was an important subject. I've only approached themes because they seem so pertinent to my life, so directly relevant to my experience. So if it is displacement, it's because I felt displaced, not that because I felt that was an important subject. In fact, I don't think I've ever made any work that has not been driven from a personal lens and personal need, and a sense of anxiety, fear, or something that was unresolved. And so I'm not someone who just sort of searches subjects, rather responds to what occupies her mind at that moment on a very personal level. I hope that's an answer that she would be satisfied with.
Yeah. We also got a question in advance from Maria Coville, who teaches AP Art History in Oviedo, Florida, to high schoolers. And she writes, my students and I study your Women of Allah series, specifically Rebellious Silence. We discuss Eastern views versus Western views of women in society. We also address martyrdom and women's roles in both wartime and peacetime. What would you like 15 to 18-year-old art history students to embrace and understand about your work?
Yes, that's an excellent question. But first of all, I think it's very important, and I think for the most people who misunderstood those work, is that the artist is not stating or is not trying to appeal with somehow that she has a complete understanding or is biased or is trying to sort of take sides. The artist is trying to present a series of questions that she has about a very complex issue. In other words, they have to understand that these work are a series of investigation of a very important subject, which means, how do people who are political, patriotic, revolutionary, religious, ideological, how do they mix religious ideas with political ideology and being a human being? Like, where do you, how do you separate the different things? So these work are really just raising important questions, but the artist is not trying to make a statement about how things are. The artist does not have the answers. These work are an excuse to open up the subject to dialogue. And I think the misunderstanding is a lot of people feel like, either I'm using these topics because they're very controversial, sensational, it kind of, cliche or how can I say, feeds the sensation of the Western. For me, it's really a series of questions that I have. By opening it up with the visual vocabulary, we're able to look at it and talk about it. How is it possible that a woman that gives birth is so feminine, it's so, it's so faithful to so many good things, but also can be holding arms and be willing to kill and commit crime? How is that possible? How do you get into that intersection? So I think this is really what the images are doing, is provoke people to discuss it, not to say this is good, this is bad, oh, she's saying that martyrdom is bad or these people are really oppressed. I'm never saying that. I never criticize people who have religious beliefs, or think a certain way. It's not my interest at all. But to really to provoke people to think about things.
And to identify with people they see on the wall.
But they wouldn't.
Mara Martinez asks, how did your aesthetic approach change as you shifted to film and video from photography?
Well, I have to say that my aesthetic is very different in photography than in video and cinema. You know, my photography is about human portraiture. You know, I just love to photograph human body. But in videos, you know, my aesthetic is about incorporating landscape, choreography, you know, architecture, um, theatrical events, actors, music. So it's very different considerations. But similar to the photographs, they're very minimal. They're often black and white. Their composition is it's very specific. It's very sculptural, and I think it borrows quite a lot from the Islamic Persian art. It's a repetition, geometry, a void, etc. And so then in the film, it's different because it's a more of a not a gallery or museum work, but it's for general audience. So it has this other um, touch, which is while it's extremely artistic, um, also more accessible, more than the video work that I make for galleries and museums. Um, and you know, I think that is something that I've negotiated over the years, how to find a balance between the aesthetic that I bring in the artwork versus the language of cinema that I've seduced by and I love, but I'm not trained. So it's really a mediation between art and cinema.
And as you finish work on the film, I wonder, because so much of the practice is interested in this liminal space between exile and belonging and questions of identity and home. And given the events of the last year globally, it's been such an unsettling time. So as you finish work on the film, what feels particularly salient, or what have you taken from the experience of the last year at home in New Mexico, elsewhere, working on the film with long-term collaborators who are like family? So,
like all people, this has been a very challenging year for me. I've had to really teach myself um, how to work, how to live in
yeah,
a completely different way.
yeah,
You know, and I think this has not been a bad thing. You know, I've learned to enjoy my solitude. I've learned to work within the pandemic in a very productive manner. We've learned to cope with our isolation and the anxiety for the world as well as ourselves, our family and loved ones. So it's been intense, really intense emotionally. I don't need to say it, everyone feels the same way. But I think it's a year that we will it will be remembered in a way that it was very transformative.
yeah.
You know, and I think, you know, it's very interesting. I made more work this year than all the previous time. And I worked diligently and nonstop because I had the luxury of time.
Yeah.
You know, the concentration that I had. And I think, you know, it really saved me. It really saved me. But nevertheless, I experienced, and I still do, a lot of anxiety about the future, the uncertainty.
Yeah.
And the uncertainty, I think, is the central theme that we have learned that things will be uncertain for a long time, and we have to learn to live with that.
Yeah.
And I find that very unsettling, even for me, who's a nomad and never knows what's tomorrow. Um, you know, I think we all have a lot of fear.
Yeah. Well, because we are a teaching collection and teaching is so central to everything that goes on at Rollins and at CFAM, I thought I would just close by reading the comments of a student who graduated in 2018, Hind, who joined us this evening. And she wrote about my beloved, I'm interested in exploring power dynamics and questions of representation. Who controls the narrative? I find this dynamic particularly meaningful in Neshat's My Beloved. I like to examine the ambiguity, the strength, and the protective grip of the women Neshat embodies. I want to understand this woman and the symbols that surround her. a global dialogue takes place here across all disciplines and beyond the college campus. So on behalf of all of the students and everyone at the museum at CFAM, I can't thank you enough, Shirin. Thank you for joining us this evening and for your friendship and dialogue over the years. I'm so grateful that you were able to join us tonight.
Very much. I would never say no to you. You know me and my work better than anyone else. And thanks to everyone who helped organize this event. I really appreciate it. And I wish every student, everyone here, a lot of luck.
Thank you, Shirin. Thanks everyone for joining us. Have a lovely evening.